Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley walked into that Electric Lady Studios session in 1978 as Ace Frehley's bandmates and, in many ways, his bosses. They were Kiss. He was the space ace, the mysterious guitarist who played his parts and stayed quiet. That's how it worked in their minds. They created the vision. He executed it. But by the end of that night, something fundamental had shifted. Ace had played them something he'd been working on alone, expecting criticism, maybe indifference. What he got instead was silence. Then Paul Stanley turning away to hide his face. Then Gene Simmons saying something that would echo through rock history. In 10 years of Kiss, we've never created anything this powerful. The question wasn't just what to do with a song that proved Ace Frehley didn't need them as much as they thought. It was what it meant for everything they'd built together. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were the architects of Kiss in 1978. They had conceived the makeup, the personas, the stage show that had turned four guys from New York into the biggest rock phenomenon in America. They wrote most of the songs. They made most of the decisions. They were the engine that drove the machine, or at least that's how they saw it, and how most people in the music industry saw it too. In their carefully constructed universe, Ace Frehley was the space ace, the silver-suited guitarist whose job was to deliver explosive solos and maintain the cool, mysterious image. He was essential to the visual package, crucial to the sound. But in the creative hierarchy, he was a player, not a creator. Gene and Paul knew Ace had talent. They'd never deny that. His guitar work on Alive had helped make Kiss a stadium act. His solos on Destroyer and Rock and Roll Over were iconic. But they saw him as a musician, not a songwriter, not someone who could carry a song from concept to completion. That perception existed throughout the industry, and even among Kiss fans. When people talked about the creative force behind Kiss, they meant Gene and Paul. Ace knew this. He'd heard the conversations that stopped when he entered the room, read the magazine articles that barely mentioned his contributions beyond his guitar playing. It bothered him more than he ever let on, because Ace had been writing songs since his teenage years in the Bronx. Nothing he thought was good enough for Kiss, nothing he pushed hard to include on albums, but he wrote constantly, late at night in hotel rooms, in the back of tour buses, during the endless hours between soundcheck and showtime. The year 1978 was unique in Kiss history. After 5 years of unbroken success, the band decided to do something unprecedented. All 4 members would release solo albums simultaneously. It was Bill Aucoin's idea, the manager's way of giving each member a creative outlet while keeping Kiss together. Gene and Paul approached their solo albums as extensions of the Kiss brand, calculated projects with professional songwriters and session musicians, designed to reinforce their positions as the band's creative leaders. For Ace, it was different. The solo album was a chance to prove something, not to the fans or the critics, but to himself. A chance to show that the quiet guy behind the silver makeup had something real to say. He'd been collecting ideas for years, melodies that didn't fit the Kiss formula, lyrics that were too personal for the Space Ace character. Now he had permission to explore them, even if Gene and Paul saw it as a harmless experiment that would ultimately prove their point about creative hierarchies. The session on September 12, 1978 wasn't supposed to be significant. Ace had been recording his solo album for weeks at Electric Lady Studios in Manhattan, the legendary facility where Jimi Hendrix had created some of his final masterpieces. Gene and Paul had stopped by before, always briefly, always with the air of supervisors checking on a project they expected to be competent but unremarkable. But this night was different. Ace had asked them to come, specifically, to hear something. His voice on the phone had been uncertain, almost apologetic. When they arrived, the studio had that particular quality of tension that comes when something important is about to happen. The session musicians, some of the best in New York, were unusually quiet. Anton Fig, the drummer Ace had hired, sat behind his kit with an expression that Gene would later describe as reverent. The engineer, Eddie Kramer, who'd worked with everyone from Hendrix to Led Zeppelin, stood at the console with his arms crossed, waiting. Ace was sitting on a stool in the main room, his black Les Paul across his lap, looking more nervous than Gene or Paul had ever seen him. "Thanks for coming," Ace said quietly. "I know you guys are busy with your own albums, but I wanted you to hear this before I finished it. I need to know what you think." Gene glanced at Paul. They'd expected to hear a blues rock workout, maybe a cover song. Safe territory. Ace adjusted his guitar, took a breath, and began to play. The opening chords were simple but haunting, a minor key progression that felt both familiar and completely new. And then Ace began to sing. His voice carried a melody that was achingly vulnerable, but it was the lyrics that stopped everything. He wasn't singing about partying all night or rock and roll fantasy. He was singing about the cost of fame, about the isolation that comes from being seen but never truly known, about the fear of losing yourself inside a character you created. He sang about looking in the mirror and not recognizing the face without makeup, about the weight of expectations from people who didn't care who you really were. It was personal in a way that went beyond typical rock confessional. This wasn't generic angst. This was Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx talking about what happened when escape became a trap. The studio became absolutely silent. Gene Simmons, who'd built a reputation on never being impressed, sat frozen. Paul Stanley, who prided himself on understanding song construction, found himself unable to move. The bridge was devastating. Ace sang about the space between who you are and who people need you to be, about loving something that's destroying you, about success that feels like failure because it's built on hiding your truth. His guitar work underneath was unlike anything he'd done with Kiss. More melodic, more expressive, every note carrying emotional weight. Anton Fig's drumming was restrained, knowing when to push and when to leave space. Eddie Kramer had captured it perfectly, giving Ace's voice an intimacy that made you feel like he was confessing directly to you. When Ace hit the final chorus, his voice cracked slightly, a moment of imperfection that made it more powerful. He let the last chord ring out before dampening the strings. The silence that followed felt endless. Ace looked up at Gene and Paul, his expression nervous. He'd just shown them something he'd never shown anyone, stripped away the Space Ace persona completely. "Well," he said finally, "I know it's different from Kiss stuff, and maybe it's too personal, but I thought—" "Stop," Paul interrupted, his voice rough. Paul stood up, walked to the glass separating the control room from the main studio, his back to everyone. His shoulders were shaking. Gene Simmons couldn't find words. He stared at Ace like he was seeing him for the first time. Not just the guitarist who played his parts, but an artist with something profound to express. "Paul?" Ace asked, worried. "Is it that bad?" Paul turned around, and his face was wet. "Bad," he repeated. "Ace, that's the best song any of us has ever written." Gene stood up, moving closer to where Ace sat. "Paul's right," Gene said, and there was something in his tone that Ace had never heard before. "In 10 years, through all the albums, all the shows, all the songs Paul and I have written together, We've never created anything with that kind of emotional honesty, that kind of depth. Ace blinked, processing words that didn't make sense with everything he'd understood about his place in Kiss. You're just being nice. We're never just nice, Paul cut in, especially not about music. How long did it take you to write that? Ace shrugged, embarrassed. Maybe 2 weeks? I'd work on it after sessions, change lyrics, try different chord progressions until it felt right. 2 weeks, Gene repeated, shaking his head. Paul and I spent 6 months on Detroit Rock City. You wrote something better in 2 weeks. Anton Fig spoke up from behind the drums. He's been writing songs like this for months. I've heard at least 4 or 5 others just as good. He just never plays them for anyone. Gene turned to Anton, then back to Ace. You have more songs? More like this? Some, Ace admitted. I've been writing a lot for the solo album. This one felt the most personal, so I wasn't sure if it was any good. Paul sat down heavily. Why haven't you brought songs like this to Kiss? Why haven't you fought to get them on albums? Because you and Gene write the songs, Ace said simply. That's how it works. I'm the guitar player. You guys are the songwriters. Everyone knows that. Everyone's wrong, Gene said. Or at least, everyone's been wrong about you. Eddie Kramer came into the main studio. Gentlemen, I've engineered records for Hendrix, for Zeppelin, for The Who. What Ace just played belongs in that conversation. It's not just good, it's important. Paul looked at Eddie, then at Ace. The question is what we do with it. Bill O'Coin is going to hear this and realize that Kiss's power dynamic might need to shift. The fans are going to hear this and wonder why the Space Ace has been so quiet all these years. If Ace's solo album outsells ours, Gene added, his voice shifting back into business mode, it changes everything about how people perceive Kiss. It changes the creative control, the entire structure we've built. The reality filled the room. Gene and Paul had worked for years to establish themselves as Kiss's leaders. They'd been generous with profit sharing, democratic about many decisions, but the creative hierarchy had always been clear. Now Ace had quietly demonstrated that hierarchy might be based on assumption rather than ability. So what are you saying? Ace asked. Are you saying I shouldn't release it? Paul and Gene looked at each other. No, Paul said finally. We're saying the opposite. We're saying you should release it, and you should be prepared for everything that comes after. What comes after? Gene smiled, but it was complicated. Everything changes. The press will pay attention to you differently. The fans will see you differently. And Paul and I will have to accept that Kiss isn't just the 2 of us with 2 other guys. It's 4 artists, and one of them has been hiding in plain sight. The conversation continued into the early morning hours at a nearby diner. Anton Fig and Eddie Kramer had left, understanding this was a conversation for the band members alone. Why did you wait so long? Paul asked. Why didn't you bring songs like this to us years ago? Ace considered the question carefully. Because every time I suggested something, you guys had a reason why it wouldn't work. Not commercial enough, too slow, too weird. After a while, I stopped suggesting things. It was easier to just play the parts and let you 2 handle the creative stuff. Gene winced. We did that, didn't we? We shut you down. Not intentionally, Paul added quickly. We thought we were protecting the band, maintaining quality control. But we were really protecting our egos, our position as the creative leaders. And I let you, Ace said. Because it was easier than fighting about it. I could play my guitar solos, cash the checks, and write my own stuff on the side. No drama. Except it made you resentful, Gene observed. And it made us blind to what you were capable of. The confession was remarkable coming from Gene Simmons. Paul laughed bitterly. The confidence was half real and half performance. We had to act like we knew what we were doing. But hearing what you just played, that's the most honest, emotionally real piece of music Kiss has ever been associated with. That's what scares me, Gene admitted. Not that it's good, but that it's so much better than what Paul and I typically write. We deal in rock and roll mythology, in party anthems. You just dealt in truth. And truth is always more powerful than mythology. The song Ace had played that night became the centerpiece of his solo album. It was called Fractured Mirror. When Kiss released all 4 solo albums simultaneously on September 18, 1978, there was an unspoken assumption about how they'd perform. Gene's album would probably sell the most. Paul's would do well with hardcore fans. Peter's would find an audience among ballad lovers. Ace's would be the wild card. The reality destroyed those assumptions. Ace's album outsold the other 3 combined in the first week. Fractured Mirror wasn't even released as a single initially, but radio stations played it anyway. Music critics who'd spent years dismissing Kiss suddenly paid attention. Rolling Stone ran a feature titled "The Space Aces' Secret Weapon, Real Artistry." The fan response was even more dramatic. Letters poured in asking, why had Ace been so quiet all these years? At concerts, the loudest cheers came during Ace's moments, and fans held signs saying "Space Ace Forever" and "Ace is Kiss." Gene and Paul handled it professionally in public. But privately, the dynamics had shifted irreversibly. Ace was no longer the quiet guitarist. He was a proven commercial and artistic force. The success should have been a triumph for Kiss. But in the complex mathematics of ego that governed rock partnerships, it became a source of tension. Paul later admitted that hearing Ace's album succeed so dramatically made him question his own abilities. Gene saw the commercial implications immediately. If Ace could sell more records solo than with Kiss, what incentive did he have to stay? The tour following the solo albums was successful, but those close to the band noticed the cracks. Ace started pushing harder for his songs to be included on Kiss albums. Gene and Paul pushed back more firmly. The breaking point came during the recording of Unmasked in 1980. Ace wanted 3 of his songs on the album. Gene and Paul agreed to 1. The argument was ugly. "You've had your solo success," Paul reportedly shouted. "Why can't that be enough?" "I'm not trying to dominate anything," Ace fired back. "I'm trying to contribute." "Maybe that's all this band needs from you," Gene said, a statement he'd later call his biggest regret. Ace left the studio that night and didn't return for a week. When he did come back, something fundamental had broken. Ace officially left Kiss in 1982. The press release talked about creative differences, the usual euphemisms. Gene and Paul replaced him with Vinnie Vincent, technically proficient, but something was missing. The Kiss that continued was successful in business terms, but diminished in spirit. Ace spent the 1980s proving he could succeed without Kiss forming Frehley's Comet. But he also struggled with demons, battling addictions, searching for an identity. When Kiss reunited in 1996, the real reconciliation happened backstage when Paul pulled Ace aside. "We were jealous," Paul said. "Gene and I were so jealous we couldn't see straight. Instead of celebrating what you'd done, we got defensive. We pushed you out because we couldn't handle the threat to our egos." Gene nodded. "The worst part is, we knew the whole time that you were right. Your songs were better, but we couldn't admit it. Ace absorbed this. I never wanted to compete with you guys. I just wanted to contribute. But you made it, so I had to choose between being invisible or being a threat. We know, Paul said quietly, and we're sorry. The reunion tours proved they could function as true partners. It wasn't perfect, but there was genuine respect now. In 2014, when Kiss was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Ace talked about that night in 1978. That moment changed everything for me. Gene and Paul's reaction told me I wasn't crazy, that the songs I'd been writing were real and valid. The years that followed were complicated. We hurt each other. But that night in the studio, when they heard what I'd created and responded with honesty, that was real. That was brotherhood. The master recording from that September night still exists. You can hear the silence after Ace finishes, and if you listen carefully, you can hear Paul's voice crack when he says, "That's the best song any of us has ever written." 3 musicians walked into a studio that night with assumptions about who they were. They walked out knowing the truth, that greatness doesn't announce itself, that the person you've been overlooking might be the one who saves you. Ace Frehley proved he was always more than the space ace, and Gene and Paul proved that real strength is acknowledging someone else's greatness, even when it threatens your position.